So, since the beginning of January, I've been leading a weekly workshop on the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. And what I so love about teaching these is that I also get to study and practice along with all of my students and dive even deeper into all the different steps on our path, which is so fun for me. And this past month, we've been exploring the ethics or sila part of our path, which includes right or wise speech, action, and livelihood, those three. And I need to confess that for so many years, I used to think that our practice of wise livelihood was the easiest one of these. Like, all right, I get it. Don't be an arms dealer or something along those lines. But over the years, honestly, I have developed such a profound respect for this part of our path, not only because it's just so incredibly rich, but because it's absolutely essential, really, to almost everything in our lives when we really take a closer look. In fact, I told my students I could probably spend an entire year just exploring this one section of our path. I really find it that important. And so I thought I'd dedicate a podcast to this often overlooked fifth spoke on our Dharma chakra, or our wheel of the Dharma, which in the Pali language is called Sama Ajiva, or wise or right living or livelihood. So to start us out, I want to share a famous teaching story from the Jataka Tales, which some of you may know are these great, wonderful old Buddhist teaching stories or myths about what are considered the many lives of the Buddha to be. And all of these are said to have happened many thousands of years before the Buddha became enlightened. And they are all about how he practiced to become the Buddha as different people and animals and even gods. So in this story, the Buddha is living in this lifetime as a monkey in a large family of monkeys in a remote jungle, and they're all happily and peacefully living in the treetops. The drama starts when a woodcutter comes into their forest to cut down some trees for his family. And when he chops down one of the biggest trees, he accidentally traps this little Buddha monkey underneath the tree. Happily, the Buddha monkey is unharmed. And when the woodcutter sees this, he decides that he's going to help this poor little fellow out by taking him to his king as a gift. And so this is what he does. He travels to the king and offers him this monkey as a gift. And now, because this monkey is actually the Buddha to be, as you might expect, he's super smart and really loving. And he quickly learns how to make just about everyone in the palace laugh. So, of course, the king just adores him and lets him roam freely all over the palace. Apparently, he was allowed into all the royal courts and even the kitchens and the guards' quarters. Just went everywhere. After a few years, though, the king began to suspect that this little monkey might be lonely for his family. And even though he truly loved him, out of a sense of great compassion, he told the woodcutter to please just take him back and release him. And so the monkey's taken back home, and as soon as he arrives, about 100 other monkeys from the village surround him and start asking him a million questions like, what was it like to live in the king's palace? But the Buddha monkey is kind of reluctant to tell them. And he says, I just don't think you want to know. But they won't let up. They really want to know what it was like. So finally, he points to one of the monkeys in the crowd and he tells him, okay, you be king. You be king. And the monkey that's singled out is incredibly excited about this and asks, what should I do next as king? So the Buddha instructs him to hop up on top of a tall rock and make it his throne. Now, he says, we will all get to work and bring you the best fruit in the kingdom. And so this monkey king sits on his rock throne, happily surveying his new kingdom, and all the other monkeys are slowly surrounding him with piles and piles of fruit from the forest, more and more piles. So throughout the day, the piles just keep growing and growing and growing. And this new Monkey King begins to feel really anxious about what's happening. And he finally cries out, "Stop, please, please stop. I could never eat all of this fruit, even in a whole year. And now there's nothing left for all of you to eat." And the Buddha monkey agrees. He says, "Of course you can't. But that doesn't matter to a king. The point is that you eat whatever you want, but you must not give any of it away. You must always keep a large pile so that others know how very rich and very powerful you are." And then the Buddha monkey tells the others, "Okay, now you must all come before your king and praise him in every way you can imagine." And the monkeys seem to like this idea, so they start saying things like, "Well, no wonder he's a king. His fur glistens like water," or "His fur is as thick as deep grass. No one is as wise and as dignified as our king." And after a while of this, the Buddha then tells them, "Okay, enough. Now it's time for you to come behind the throne and say terrible things about the king." And at first, the monkeys just really don't like this at all, and they refuse to do it. But the Buddha monkey tells them, "You said you wanted to learn the ways of the people to see what it's like. So this is what you need to do." And so all the monkeys slowly gather behind the rock and they start whispering insults about the king. And they say things like, "Have you noticed how old and confused the king seems lately?" Or, "I think his fur is getting extremely thin, and I think he might be going bald in some very funny spots." Another says, "I notice the king eats more like a pig than a monkey." And this just goes on, and they all start laughing. And as the insults continue, the laughter gets louder and louder until finally this monkey king just can't stand it anymore, and he leaps off his throne and starts running after all the others to the trees. But since all of them are running in all different directions, he can't seem to catch any of them. And finally, when the Monkey King returns to his throne, he's exhausted. He discovers that all the fruit is gone because all the other monkeys have taken it. And he says to the Buddha monkey, "Now what do I do?" And the Buddha says, "Yep, it's a shame. But these things happen even to kings. Now your guards must go find the thieves. That's what a king would do. And when the guards capture the thieves, they must be sentenced to death at once." And the Monkey King cries, "No, no more, no more." And then all the other monkeys who are, of course, watching this agree, "Stop it. No, we don't want to know anything else about the ways of people and kings." And after hearing this, the Monkey King crawls down off his throne, and all the monkeys slowly gather back together. And the Buddha monkey recites this short poem that he'd written about life in the palace. He wrote, "The gold is mine, the gold is mine, so they cry, both night and day. These foolish folk who live in splendor never think about the holy way." They never think about the holy way. And that holy way is what the Buddha called right, wise, or skillful living or livelihood, which we might then think of as how we usually obtain a certain fruit for ourselves. And by the way, this fruit includes not only our jobs, but any way that we receive money, support, benefit, or compensation in some way. So, for instance, this can include things like negotiating inheritance, maybe with our families, or maybe the money we receive in some way from the government, money we receive from our families, or the home we're living in, or some other benefits also, like maybe our upbringing, or the color of our skin, or our gender. So often a great question we can use for this one is to honestly ask ourselves, what might I be taking for granted? That's a kind of benefit. What might I be taking for granted? So with Right Livelihood, as with all of our spokes on the wheel, what we're working with, again, is a sense of self. And this one in particular, as you may have already sensed, has a bit of an edge to it because it points to what we're believing about our own worth, as well as what we're believing about the worth of others. So a really tricky and often really emotional topic here. So our practice of the step is actually crucially important, especially because as the teachings show us over and over again, what we believe eventually tends to become our destiny. In the suttas, the Buddha tells us the thought manifests as the word manifests as the deed develops into character. So watch the thought and its ways with care, and let it spring from love born out of concern for all beings. And of course, this always and forever needs to include ourselves. So, for instance, when we're considering right livelihood and we're a woman maybe, and even some part of us believes that we are somehow less deserving than men, we might be less likely to complain about receiving less for doing the very same job, or worse, maybe even believing that we somehow don't deserve it. And of course, our beliefs around this are going to affect our entire lives. On a much larger scale, when there's a broader cultural belief about who is more or less deserving, these beliefs tend to shape our actual national policies, which of course very directly affect people's livelihoods. And so again, a vitally important part of our practice is for us to very closely examine what we're believing about ourselves and others, or what we're saying to ourselves. Because as the Buddha reminds us, this is going to strongly determine our actions in this world. So when we're practicing right livelihood, we're also being asked to really consider the second spoke of our wheel of the Dharma, which is right intention, and to ask ourselves how we are applying this intention in terms of what we're offering to the world. So, as an inquiry, we are being asked to continually contemplate, is how I'm obtaining my fruit, if you will, bringing any harm or suffering to myself or others? And is it truly benefiting or bringing less suffering to myself and others? Those contemplations. One of the ways we can contemplate these questions is to take a very close and honest look at what the Buddha called the three poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion, and ask ourselves honestly if we're practicing any of these qualities when it comes to our livelihoods. So with that first one, greed, we might remember that in practice, the very opposite of greed is called dana, or generosity, our ability to let go, or maybe to stop clinging. So dana involves nurturing our ability to share, which is actually something the Buddha is asking us to consciously practice, because it can often be difficult for us. And because it's so difficult, we often end up acting out on that second poison, which is ill will. So it's something we are really asked to contemplate. Our wanting, or tanha in Pali. Is our wanting creating a sense of greed in us? And or are we in some way offering our ill will out to others who we either don't want to share with, or with those who we think aren't sharing with us in some way? It's also incredibly important for us to be honest with ourselves about that third poison, which is delusion, which can show up in many different ways. But the two main ways include a belief of, I'm somehow not worthy of fill in the blank, or I'm somehow more worthy of fill in the blank. I'm somehow not worthy, I'm somehow more worthy of fill in the blank. Which again, honestly, can really get tricky sometimes, can it? Because we actually do need to sometimes give credit where credit is due. So for instance, maybe we've spent decades becoming an expert at something, and our experience is more valued than someone with less experience. In this case, our experience really is worth more than that of another person's experience, even though we ourselves as a person are not more worthy than the other person. It is simply our experience that is more valued. And this is a really important distinction, the difference between identity and experience, which of course is a large part of our practice, separating those two things out. So sometimes where the delusion of being more worthy can show up is in a kind of belief that serves to justify the first two poisons of greed and ill will. And so, for instance, we might ask ourselves if we're doing something that involves being deceitful or harmful or maybe even cruel, and telling ourselves something like, well, someone needs to do it, or hey, I'm just doing my job, or I don't like it, but I need to make a living too. I'll actually never forget a conversation I ever heard about 25 years ago now between my former brother-in-law and another very wealthy man who were attending a party at my parents' house in Connecticut. And my brother-in-law at the time was a big banker, and he and the man were drinking and laughing together and saying something to the effect of, if they don't realize that we're cheating them, that's just their fault for being so naive. And they were laughing about that. And my brother-in-law and that man were both holding a common false belief that I've heard actually many times in my life. When people try to excuse their bad behavior by using phrases like, that's just business, or that's just how it's done. And of course, there are many problems with this, but one of the main ones is that whenever we feel somehow supported in our deception or our delusion, as my brother-in-law did with that other man, it can sometimes really escalate. It can be like, well, so-and-so's doing it too, so, or maybe everyone else does it, etc. Earlier this year, my husband brought home a movie from the library called Bad Education with Hugh Jackman. And I'm sorry to ruin it for some of you, but the movie is based on a true story of a school superintendent and his assistant who started taking money out of this wealthy school district in Long Island in the early 2000s. And it started with just one of them stealing to buy something as simple as a coffee. And then it was a hamburger, and then it was a lunch at a fancy restaurant, etc. And what happened is that once they figured out that nobody was really monitoring this money jar, they ended up taking more and more and more and getting more and more of their friends and family members on board too. And before they were caught, years later, more than 30 people were involved in this scheme, and they had stolen more than $11 million from the school district. And one of their many different excuses, or maybe what they told themselves about this, was because the school district was so wealthy and because it had taken so long for them to be found out, they weren't really hurting anyone. And, poor them, they were working so hard, they felt that they actually deserved it to steal. So with this example, we might recognize a delusion of separateness or a delusion of self, and how defending or protecting or propping up a self can create so much harm. And the problem is whenever we're coalescing around a delusion of self, we're going to be much more inclined to only share with those who are the closest to us. Maybe those in our immediate family or our personal circle of friends, which means we're really only willing to share with those who we feel are in some way an extension of us. And this tendency not to share often comes from a sense of lack, from a sense of not enough to go around, not enough for me, or even a sense of I deserve it or my family deserves it, but not others. And again, to support this belief, we can often make up all sorts of stories about the person or the people that we don't want to share with, just like my brother-in-law and that man were doing. So for instance, we might put people into a category of other or label them in some kind of derogatory way, which tends to dehumanize them. Like we might believe things like that person or those people are lazy, or they don't work as hard as me, or they don't deserve it, or they're going to take away something that is mine. Sometimes we can even believe that they're evil, even. So we can harbor these beliefs about certain individuals in our lives, maybe friends or family members who we judge are in some way not as deserving. But of course, these beliefs can also manifest in much larger ways, with actual hatred and even harm being directed at whole groups of people. For instance, like immigrants, or through racism, or by resenting entire countries and everyone who lives in those countries, deeming them all as other. We don't want to share with those countries. And this is really how all wars start, isn't it? And it's so often about resources, not being willing to share the fruits of our forest, if you will, even though the truth is that if we all work together, there would be much more than plenty. We might also consider all the powerful politicians out there who are doing things that they know are destroying our country, but they don't want to lose their own individual jobs and are willing to sacrifice literally millions and millions of other people for their own individual personal ambition and desire. This kind of individual delusion, or maybe extreme selfishness, actually relates to the Buddha's teachings about the 5 types of businesses he felt that we should avoid or maybe not engage in. And again, I think these 5 are still relevant today, even 2,600 years later. These 5 are dealing in weapons, is the first one. Dealing in human beings, which today might include not paying people a good minimum wage or owning private prisons or, putting children in cages, etc. Dealing in human beings. Dealings in meat, dealing in intoxicants, and dealing in poison. And whenever I'm investigating these 5, I often think of that last type of business, poison, when I'm remembering my dear father-in-law, who I really loved a lot. And tragically, he was one of the many victims of this giant pharmaceutical company that I won't name that sold pain pills that were kind of like Advil. And the company absolutely knew that these pills were going to give a certain number of people heart attacks. They knew it. And this is exactly what happened to my beloved 65-year-old father-in-law, who had just recently retired and was planning to spend the rest of his life with his wife and our family. And the doctors, after he had died, all agreed that the heart attack was due to him taking those pills. So essentially, people in this company knew that their product was going to kill a certain number of people, and they intentionally lied about it. And they lied because they had calculated that they could afford the settlement bills, and that even with the bad publicity, they could still continue to rake in millions and millions of dollars without losing their company. And as you might imagine, that's exactly what happened. The company now rakes in almost $50 billion in profits every year. So they were right, and they knew it. My father-in-law's death was absolutely calculated as a way to make the company more money. And by the way, they were actually violating almost every single one of the standards that the teachings lay out for us on how we should earn our living. These 5 ways include acquiring it honestly, not by trickery or deceit, acquiring it by legal means, so not illegally, acquiring it in ways that do not involve harm or suffering for any being, and finally acquiring it peacefully without coercion or violence. And as you might recall, one of the main causes of our suffering, besides hatred and delusion, is greed, or maybe wanting more than what is reasonable, wanting more than what is reasonable, and wanting more and more of it. Again, when we want all of the fruit in the forest, or more of the fruit than others. And again, this is delusion. In fact, studies have shown that even those who have millions or even billions of dollars still think they need more. They are really caught up in an addiction of self. And instead of worshiping these people as we do kind of as a society, the Buddha would say we should actually all be very concerned, because according to the teachings, they are not only causing great suffering, but they're actually also truly experiencing great suffering. In Buddhist cosmology, especially the Tibetan tradition, which I was first trained in, greed is often represented in the form of pretas, or hungry ghosts. And the story is that there are these beings who have been reborn into the realm of the hungry ghosts, and they now all have these tiny, tiny little pinhole mouths and huge, gigantic stomachs. And because their mouths are so tiny and their hunger so great, they can never, ever be satisfied. And so they suffer greatly, all the while doing really unskillful things in order to try to fill their great and totally insatiable need. And we can all see how we all do this at different levels. The teacher and healer Teoskai points to the way that we ourselves can take on the metaphoric shape of these hungry ghosts. She says, everything has a vibration. When you embody the energy of wanting, the vehicle of your being takes a particular shape, the shape of wanting. And in the shape of wanting, nothing can be truly received. Love cannot fit into this shape. Prosperity cannot fit into this shape. Peace cannot fit into this shape. There's also a story that I vividly remember from the teacher Sylvia Boorstein, where she talks about what we all really need. And she wrote this. She said, in the early years of my practice, a group of Burmese monks were guest teachers for a week at a retreat at which I was a student in Southern California. They were housed in one of the cottages at the edge of the retreat center. And one morning after breakfast, the retreat manager announced, the monks are leaving this morning. If you want to, you can stand outside their cottage as a gesture of respect as they leave. So I stood silently with the other retreatants and watched the monks walk out single file from the cottage, each one carrying his begging bowl in a string bag. I realized that whatever they were wearing, whatever they were carrying, and whatever was in those 2 suitcases on top of the minibus they were traveling in constituted all of their worldly goods. Watching the monks seemed to me a visual representation of the truth that not needing more, not needing other, is the end of suffering. I thought, they have everything they need. They have everything they need. And I've actually developed a kind of practice around this story, which is that whenever I find myself walking around my little tiny rented cottage in the woods, feeling somehow, deprived of things or feeling poor in some way, thinking that I need more space, a better couch, etc., I tell myself, I have everything I need. I have everything I need. And then I really try to lean into that belief, which usually tends to turn my greed into gratitude for everything I do have. In fact, it very often makes me want to start getting rid of things rather than accumulating even more things. In the teachings, the Buddha suggests that we all need just 4 essential things for living: food, clothing, shelter, and medicine, which are often called the 4 requisites. And of course, water is included in the food category. Food, clothing, shelter, and medicine. But before you start throwing out everything you own, it might be helpful to know that the Buddha was not advocating poverty in any way or asking us to deprive ourselves. As always, he was urging us to follow the middle way, to be mindful not to accumulate more than we need, and to not deprive ourselves so much that it makes us unhappy. And of course, what this looks like is really going to be different for each one of us. And so with our practice of right livelihood, one of the things we're being asked to do is to look into our own hearts and minds and discover for ourselves what this balanced life might look like. Again, by investigating what truly brings us happiness and what leads to more suffering. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha explains it this way. He says, a person knows his or her income and expenditures and leads a balanced life, neither extravagant nor miserly, so that the income exceeds expenditures rather than the reverse. Just as a goldsmith or his apprentice, holding up a scale, knows, by so much it has dipped down, by so much it has tilted up, so a family man or woman leads a balanced life. So the idea is that when we're investigating what might bring us more balance, we not only need to ask ourselves if we're taking more than is reasonable, but if we are somehow giving more than is reasonable. And one way to think about this might be to ask ourselves, am I giving away so much fruit, if you will, that I am unable to feed myself well? Or am I maybe too exhausted to feel happy and peaceful in my own life because I'm working too hard gathering all that fruit for other people? I've never been able to discover where this quote came from, but there's a modern phrase that relates to this, which I really love to remember, or maybe remind myself of often, which is, you are not required to burn your house down to keep others warm. You are not required to burn your house down to keep others warm. So, with our practice of right livelihood, we are also being asked to discover more balance by more deeply recognizing the truth of both our interdependence and our independence, that balance. What this means is that we recognize that we actually cannot do it all, and we can't have it all either. Along with the truth that we all need each other, and we ourselves are also needed. We are also needed. In fact, it is this profound recognition of this balance between our independence and our interdependence that can cut through the source of our deepest suffering and wounding. Again, this is a sense of feeling separate. Because if we think about it, when we're giving too much, there's a sense of being less than or maybe less deserving. And when we're taking too much, there's a sense of being more than or more deserving. And both of these ways of being separate us, which cause suffering. So when we are practicing right living and trying to find more of a balance, we really want to more clearly see what the story about the Monkey King was pointing to, which is that our own happiness really does depend on the happiness of everyone else. That's sort of the summary of Right Livelihood, that our own happiness really does depend on the happiness of everyone else as well. So I think I will end there. And if you'd like to, you can close your eyes, come into a bit of a practice. Taking a deep breath in, slow breath out. Arriving here in the body. And if you're walking, you might sense your feet on the earth, the movement of your body, the breath in the body. If you're driving, sensing your feet and your sit bones, the body being held. Let yourself become embodied. Letting the body relax. Face, jaw, shoulders, tummy, hands. You might just contemplate the truth of that phrase from Sylvia Boorstein, which is, I have everything I need. See how that resonates. I have everything I need. There's resistance to that. Just notice what it is. Just shine a light on it. And then see if you can come back to the phrase again. And really see if you can embody that and feel the safety of that. The safety of, I have everything I need. What would it feel like if that were absolutely true? And with the eyes still closed, just listening to this poem, A Good Day's Work, by the poet David Hazard, who tells us, on the morning you feel flat and anything but useful, or that there's a purpose, rise and take your place, just making tea or coffee, scrambling eggs. That's all for now. Just be. There is a reason, a very good reason, you're here. Maybe later, when a cheerless cashier is handing you change, you smile a little or just nod and say, thank you, or I hope you have a really nice day, or that color looks good on you. And though you don't know it, that's just what they need to hear in the middle of a hard shift at work, or after a gauntlet of complaints, or because someone they love is in a bad way. It takes so little, really, to do a good day's work. Namaste and blessings. I hope you enjoyed this talk. These talks are always offered freely so that no one is ever denied access to these teachings, and your support really makes a difference. Dana is an ancient Pali word meaning spontaneous generosity of heart. If you feel inspired to offer dana, you can do so by visiting my website at www.mindfulvalley.com. Thank you so much.